Hey guys, it's the Scholar General, Bing. Today is another sword review, and this sword is a lot different than many of the other ones I've reviewed in the past. This is the LK Chen Liao Dao. So like normal, this sword was sent to me for the purposes of a video review, and then after this video, I'll be either sending it back to LK Chen or perhaps sending it on to someone else to make a video of their own. So first I'm going to talk about the history related to this sword, and then I'm going to get into some details about this blade, and then go swing it around and do some cutting with it. And it's a lot of fun. So the name Liao Dao literally means Twin Peaks Liao Dynasty Dao. And Twin Peaks is a reference to these two protrusions on the spine of the blade which look like mountain peaks. And this sword is called a Liao Dao because it's a Dao, or single-edged blade, from the Liao Dynasty. And the Liao Dynasty was my big focus when I was in grad school, and I would say it's pretty much my favorite Chinese dynasty, but that's always a hard choice. The Liao dynasty is very interesting and unique for a variety of reasons, but the first thing to know about the Liao is that it was founded by nomadic people known as the Kitans. So it's traditionally considered a Chinese dynasty in Chinese historiography, but it is not the same as most of the other dynasties. So there's this steppe people called the Kitans, and their origins are very mysterious. I'm not going to get into all that. It's super complicated, and the sources are not always clear, but they have the Kitans, and they really show up and start forming a state in the chaos of the fall of the Tang. So the Tang dynasty starts to collapse, and then the Kitans are able to really come into their own as a group and exert pressure and make territorial gains during this time period. So the Liao dynasty, or the Great Kitan State, was founded by a man named Lu Abaoji, and his wife also played a big part, but we won't talk about that right now. Abaoji was elected leader among a confederacy of Kitan groups, but it was just a temporary thing. They would elect a new leader every 3 years or so. He managed to retain his power by doing a lot of different things, but one of the main things he did was he declared himself the Chinese-style emperor. And he was able to do this in part because he owned some territory that was in the Central Plains region. A lot of different things like massacring most of his enemies, so that's one way to win. But after he won, and he had his new dynasty, the Liao became very unique and interesting because they managed to effectively fuse many elements of the steppe and China kind of into one empire state. So there's many examples of this. For one, the emperor or the Khagan of the Liao dynasty lived in a tent like a nomad. Even though the dynasty had 5 capitals, that was actually done in kind of imitation of the Tang dynasty in order to claim legitimacy as a Chinese dynasty. But in reality, the political center of the Kitan state lie with the Khagan, who lived in an Ordo that would go through seasonal rotations, and it was known as Natpat. Another example of this is that the Kitans decided to create a written script for their language, but when they did so, they took Chinese characters and they heavily modified them and made it like an alphabet, a phonetic script. And in many ways, certain things about the Liao dynasty served as predecessors for later steppe empires and dynasties, such as the Jin and the Yuan, the Mongols, as well as the Qing. So now let's take a more detailed look at the actual blade here, and then think about how this blade fits into the context of the Liao dynasty. Overall, this Dao is very heavy. It's about 5 pounds, which is a lot. Especially considering that the blade is just under 30 inches, so it's not like a massively long blade. It's not like a big, giant two-hander, but it has the mass of many two-handers. Part of that becomes clear if you look at the spine. The spine on this blade is just an absolute monster, and super thick, very extremely durable. Personally, I really like the aesthetic of this blade. I think it looks really nice, and it also has some pretty good geometry for cutting because it has this thick spine, which makes it very durable and resilient, but then it just kind of, goes straight to the edge. It doesn't have any secondary bevel, so that really helps it glide through targets, especially because the mass also carries the blade through targets. However, even though the blade is very heavy and the sword itself is extremely heavy, like this thing is impossible to use with one hand really. Like you can kind of try, but it just weighs too much to move it around. Even though this Dao has an absolutely massive blade, it also has a very long handle and a pretty big, interesting pommel. And what this does is it brings the point of balance actually fairly close to the hilt. See? But despite that fact, the overall mass is just way too much to like effectively use this with one hand. It's just kind of impossible. Which, I mean, makes sense just looking at it. However, whenever you put two hands on this thing, it all of a sudden starts to become alive, and you can actually move it around and manipulate it pretty well. Another thing that really makes this Dao interesting is that if we look at Tang Dynasty Dao, they basically all have straight blades. And during the Liao Dynasty, we start to see both single-handed and two-handed Dao that are curved. And this blade actually looks quite similar to, things like the Yanyue Dao or the Guan Dao, like the glaive, as well as some Pu Dao and even like, early Da Dao, especially like the Guan Dao. The Guan Dao frequently also has these protrusions on the back of the blade. Now they are much bigger, and they're actually used for like kind of hooking motions where you catch, something on the back of the blade and then you can, knock it off to the side and then make a cut. But these ones are not really big enough to do anything like that. They're mostly just for looks. But the general form and shape of this blade is something that, we see in the Liao Dynasty and continues on throughout Chinese history. So another super interesting thing about this blade is the design of the tunko. Now you can see the tunko has this piece which, goes up the edge, and that's something which is clearly related to a thing that's known as the Turco-Mongol saber. So Turco-Mongol sabers are this type of saber that appears in Eastern Europe, in the 8th century or so, give or take, and it spreads from there along the steppe all the way to East Asia. And this is probably related to the curvature as well. I mean, I should say that you can find curved Dao in China going way back into the Han Dynasty and even earlier, but they weren't ever mainstream. And the fact that the Turco-Mongol saber appears and with this type of tunko, and then it spreads all the way to China, and then curved swords start to become more popular in China along with this type of tunko, seems to suggest that the reason that most of our Dao are curved today is due to the influence of things like the Turco-Mongol saber, which was first introduced to China during the Liao Dynasty, but became mainstream during the Mongol Dynasty or the Yuan Dynasty. If we take a look at the guard, we can see it has these 4 big lobes, and that's just called a 4-lobe discard in English. And one of the names for it in Chinese is called a shi di wen. Now, shi di literally means like the top leaves of a persimmon, and it makes more sense if you actually see a persimmon and you look at it. It looks like the kind of the leaf cap of a persimmon. So that's that. But that name is just a name that's given by collectors. In the past, they wouldn't have had all these necessarily specific terminology for things. And then we have a ferrule right here, which just helps reinforce things. We have this nice wooden handle. It's very sturdy, has a thick tang, and the handle has 2 pegs which secure the handle scales onto the tang. The thing is, whenever you have a big, long handle that's two-handed like this, it's just, I usually prefer to have like a wrapped grip, but for this type of sword, and if it's two-handed, you don't necessarily need that. Things are just different, because you're not just relying on one hand to make the weapon. Moving on down to the pommel, it looks very large from this side, but it's actually flat if you look at it from this angle. So, however, it does have a lot of mass. It does help counterbalance things some. Now, the shape, modern collectors would call this Lo-huan, or like a gourd shape. And I've talked about the gourd shape. It's very prominent motif in lots of Chinese art. The fact that the pommel is thin is pretty interesting. You could also use it to strike, and I'm sure that would feel very unpleasant. On top of that, you have a hole in the middle of the pommel. Now this brings up a lot of interesting questions. Is it just for looks? Is it for mounting on a wall? Is it for, presumably not for a tassel? The question is, do you count this as a ring pommel? So why would a dynasty that is like half nomad, half Chinese ever need a sword like this? Because in my experience, just kind of handling this weapon and all that stuff, I do not think this is a weapon intended to be used on horseback. But I also do not think this is a weapon intended to be carried in civilian contexts. which seems pretty obvious. I mean, it's just a massive blade. It's very heavy. It would be very hard to get like a really proper fitted scabbard for this thing. I should show you guys the scabbard that did come with it. It just a modern leather scabbard with these buttons on it that helps these clasp it onto the blade. It's for safety mostly. In the past, these big swords like this probably wouldn't have a scabbard because it's not really made to be worn conveniently. It's just too big, and if you're gonna have this, it's because you're gonna go fight someone. You're not gonna carry it around unless you're gonna go to the fight. So why would the Liao Dynasty want to use a blade like this? What was the point of it? And the first thing I should say is that they did not use it very much because these are extremely, extremely rare, and there's only a handful of them in a couple museums scattered in China. Meanwhile, we have some weapons from the Liao Dynasty which are extremely common, like maces and things like that. So it's fairly clear to me where their priorities lie. On top of that, we also have historical sources which go over exactly what kind of the equipment of certain Kitan soldiers were expected to carry, and they don't mention anything like this. So I think it's fairly straightforward to say that this type of blade was not something which was, normally carried very frequently in the time period. And I actually think a blade like this might be useful for an elite soldier or perhaps a bodyguard of the Kagan. I say that because, a lot of the armor worn during this time period was like heavy lamellar, especially during the Jin Dynasty, which just followed the Liao. So this is kind of the heyday of really heavy-duty lamellar armor. And if you're going to fight in armor, especially if you are wearing armor and you don't have to have a shield, then a weapon like this I would see as being very useful. A lot of mass, and what you can do is, it has a pretty good point. You could do some strong thrusts, even though it's perhaps not optimized for thrusts as much as something like a spear, of course. But you can also target areas of the body that the lamellar might not cover as much. Now, frequently, you can make lamellar that can pretty much encase the entire human, including the armpits and things like that. But most of the time, you can make, upward cuts to the armpits. You can try to target the insides of the leg, and you can always stab the face or try to cut the face. And if your weapon's heavy duty enough, you can just start hitting them in the helmet and give them the concussion. So a weapon like this, I think, could be very useful for someone fighting in armor, perhaps against someone with armor or against someone without armor. And I think this is primarily an infantry weapon, so not one that you'd be using on horseback. So because of that, I'm kind of inclined to lean towards something like the bodyguard unit or something like that. The context in which someone would be on foot in full armor, or perhaps fighting against someone in full armor, would be on campaign at the imperial encampment. So the emperors of the Liao Dynasty, or the Kagans, every emperor had what's called an Ordo. And Ordo is literally the same word as horde in English, but it means something a little different. So Ordo is like an entire city or that travels around with the emperor. And it would have, almost, some of them could have had like as many as 100,000 people or perhaps more. So there'd be these big nomadic encampments, and they would travel around seasonally, and a big detachment of that would be, nomads who are herders but also soldiers at the same time. And because in nomadic society, if you're a herder, you have the same skills as a soldier because of the way they hunt and the way that they wrestle animals all day. So that was kind of the main core of the Liao army. And I don't think that's who would be using these. I think that these would be reserved for the bodyguard force for the emperors or the Kagans, which was known as the Fuxinbu in Chinese sources. And it's also, there's another army type of detachment that was special, and which is called the Pishijun, and it's somewhat related to the Fuxinbu. I won't get into all the details. These would be, highly trained, more elite soldiers that were under the direct command of the emperor. And I think that some of them may have been using a weapon like this. So now that we've talked a little more about, what the sword is and perhaps where it may have fit into Liao society historically, let's talk a little bit about, how awesome it is and how much fun it is to use and how it might have been used. So a couple things that stand out to me about this weapon are, number one, probably wearing armor, because if you just have this weapon and someone's coming at you, stabbing you with a spear, it's a little heavy to be moving around very quickly, and you're likely to get stabbed. So I think that wearing armor is a good way to protect yourself while you're, maneuvering this heavy weapon, and you can focus on, really doing damage. In addition to that, as I said, I don't think that this weapon is long enough to be very effective from horseback. So whenever I was swinging this weapon around, I decided to put on my weight vest, which weighs about 45 pounds or around 20 kilograms, give or take, and wearing that extra weight can be quite exhausting, but the weapon itself is really nice and maneuverable. As far as techniques go, I've never actually formally trained in Da Dao, Pu Dao, or Quan Dao. I have done a little bit of Miao Dao / Dan Dao training, but I found that this weapon I could kind of borrow from pretty much all of these different weapon move sets. And is that how they used it in the past? We really don't know, because we have zero sources for what this would be, how this would be used exactly. So perhaps they could have used it similar to how I used it, but we don't know for sure. So as you can see, the proportions and the blade on this doll really make it an awesome cutter. I'm not the best cutter in the world, but even I was able to get off some pretty nice cuts with this, and it, is a lot of fun to use. And if you're interested in getting your hands on this unique weapon, then you can follow the link in the description and go check out LK Chen's website. As always, thank you all for watching. Please subscribe and don't forget to stay sharp.